Hi, that's great then. So thanks very much, Alex, for coming. I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation. And as I say, we'll record it for our YouTube channel now. So over to you, Alex.
No problem, thanks, Pam. I will attempt to screen share and then I will just double check that you can see that before I do anything else. So, Pam, sorry, Angie, are you okay
Okay, yeah.
to just let me know? Can you see that okay?
Yeah, I can see that. I can see the bit on the left-hand side as well as
Brilliant.
the
Lovely. So if
screen.
I do that and minimize my
That's
little
brilliant. Yeah, that's
Zoom
brilliant.
thing and I pop you at the bottom, we should be okay. All right. Okay. So, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk to you guys around autism and trauma. Really thinking about what that means and how we can support children and young people manage their resulting feelings as a result of any experiences that they might have gone through. Obviously, when we're talking about trauma, we are talking about things that might trigger a response within us. So, if you need to pause the recording or take a moment out to just do a bit of self-care, please do, and then come back when you're ready. So just put that out there at the beginning. Hopefully, what I'm aiming to achieve today are kind of three different things. So first of all, I wanted to just explore what we mean when we say trauma, because it's a word that's used a lot, but it's important to know what we actually mean and what we understand by that term. Also, to think about how being misunderstood can cause trauma. I think this is particularly relevant for autistic individuals, neurodiverse individuals. And then finally, to think about ways in which we can support children and young people manage those feelings that result from that experience of being misunderstood that can then cause a sort of trauma response in situations that are then similar in the future. So that's my aim, or those are my aims, the purpose of the session. So just going to start off then thinking about what we mean when we hear the word trauma. So couple of things, couple of quotes up there for you around how trauma is currently being defined. A couple of things to pull out from those quotes are that trauma can happen to anyone at any time. It is something that takes many shapes and forms. And it's also something that isn't necessarily a sustained event. It could be something that is repeated over time, but sometimes it can be a one-off event. So when we're looking at traumatic events, experiences, it's hard to define them. And one of the key things is about perception. So if someone has gone through something which they feel is particularly upsetting, traumatic, then we need to be respectful of that and we need to understand where they're coming from, but also help them to think about how they can manage any feelings that are coming up from that event. So rather than thinking, well, I'm not finding that upsetting, but so why are they? We need to turn it around to, well, I'm not finding it upsetting, but they are. So how can I support them with that? And that's particularly relevant for those with autism, because sometimes it can be hard for them to put themselves in that other person's shoes and understand that that other person might be experiencing something that's traumatic. But equally, they may find it hard to communicate when they are experiencing something that is traumatic. And we will look at the dynamics of that communication shortly when we come on to look at things that can be influencing on someone with autism experiencing trauma as a result of being misunderstood. So, thinking about autism and trauma, then, one of the things that often crops up when we think about trauma is the idea of developmental trauma. And that usually links with things called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And the research around that topic is normally associated with things that are adverse in childhood, such as ongoing abuse or neglect. But one of the things that we can also experience in childhood, particularly if you have autism or another type of neurodiversity, is the idea of being repeatedly misunderstood. So it's very relevant to the autistic population to think about how they might experience trauma as a result of being repeatedly misunderstood. Research on ACEs is incredibly high. There's a lot out there. What's less researched is that idea of being misunderstood. But what we have found is that from an autism and trauma point of view, these things are the type of situations that can occur, which then result in that repeated exposure to misunderstandings or being misunderstood. So I'm just going to leave that image up there while I talk you through a couple of other key points. So do bear with me. But although research is lacking, one of the things that has been identified is that the world itself, as the quote here says, seems to put people who are autistic in a sort of punished situation, a situation of being rejected or marginalized just for being themselves, just for letting their autistic traits, as it were, to come out and be seen. But they're classed as sort of wrong or unacceptable. And that repeated message can cause that idea of trauma being, as a result of being misunderstood. Oh, don't press the wrong arrow key is the answer to that one. So one of the other things is that autistic people are more susceptible to being misunderstood because of the way in which they see the world. I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding sometimes around an assumption that someone with autism is unable to display empathy or is unable to understand the feelings of others. Now, rather than being unable to do that, they can. It just takes them a little bit more time to understand, to process, to think about the information that they're receiving and pull it all together to then think, oh, that's what's happening here. And one of the things that can often happen is that in that processing time, people assume that they haven't necessarily understood or don't get it, but they don't give them the time to help process and understand. So that's one of the ways in which being misunderstood can occur. And it's often that sort of small nuggets of being misunderstood that keep happening over that long period of time that lead to things on the left being the sort of situation that is being experienced. So one of the things that we do need to acknowledge is that although this is more likely, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a certainty, but it does mean that something we need to keep an eye out for, both as parents and as educators. So thinking about all of this in a bit more detail, one of the key pieces of research that has come about most recently is the idea of the double empathy problem. This may be something that you've heard of. Bear with me as I talk through it, but hopefully it's something that we can explore together and we can find helpful to put a kind of theory to a name, as it were. So with the double empathy problem, one of the things that makes it more likely for autistic individuals to experience trauma from being misunderstood is this double empathy and the situation where, for example, squirrels, i.e. autistic individuals, have no problem at all communicating between each other. And beavers or neurotypicals also have no problems communicating between each other. So like-minded with like-minded, there's a sense of being understood and understanding in those two scenarios. It continues with understanding that when squirrels and beavers then, or autistic individuals and neurotypical individuals try to talk to each other, it can get a bit tricky and misunderstandings can occur. However, for some reason, it's down to the squirrels, the autistics, to change. So essentially, the double empathy problem suggests that autistic people have difficulty fitting into society, not just because they misunderstand others, but also because they are misunderstood by others. And it means that when we consider ways of helping, we need to look beyond the individual to the wider network around them, helping both the individual with autism and neurotypical people around them to share their worlds, to each make adjustments so that everyone can communicate effectively and feel understood and hopefully avoid miscommunications and misunderstandings. So when we consider ways of addressing things like the double empathy problem, helping to prevent misunderstandings from occurring, and therefore that idea about trauma from being misunderstood occurring, we can look at some of the protective factors that are in place around the individual. to then look at what's going well, but also ways in which we might be able to support. So one clear protective factor is to help others understand what autism is. And I think more recently, there's been so much work done across all age ranges to support people in understanding what autism is. And also the fact that just because you've met one person with autism, as a classic, as we know, doesn't mean to say you've met every person with autism. You know, it's a part of who they are. And it doesn't mean to say that that's going to be the same across everybody, just the same as someone with dyslexia or someone with ADHD, that's going to be presenting the same across all of those individuals. We know this, but we want others to understand that as well. So working to support others' understanding of autism is a key protective factor to help that wider network appreciate what might be going on and how they can adjust to then support the person with autism to understand. Another clear protective factor is the way in which we can validate and normalize emotions, that these are things that everybody experiences. No emotion is wrong, as it were, or incorrect. All emotions are valid. It's the way we manage them, the way we handle them, that can then be the next step of developing our skills in that area. And I think one of the things that can be particularly challenging for others to understand is when someone with autism perhaps experiences an extreme or heightened emotion, they can need help to manage that and to share that emotion, because that's the tricky bit. So helping others to understand what's going on, but also helping the individual themselves to skill themselves up for managing emotions, understanding what emotions are and communicating those effectively is another way that we can protect against that experience of trauma from being misunderstood. One of the other key protective factors is respecting those sensory sensitivities and exploring adaptations together. And I think in the home, when we're as part of a family, that's quite something that we can do quite, I would say, quite easily. Sometimes it can be tricky, but we pick up on those things and we're able to adjust and adapt. But it's giving that information then to others and helping others to understand how they can adapt and explore things together. That's going to be quite key. Again, one of the challenges that can occur is that extra time needed to process. So when we're giving messages to support others' understanding of autism, one of the key messages that we can give is don't keep repeating. That's not necessarily something that's going to be helpful, because the person with autism can then be in a cycle of, but I just don't get it, but I just don't get it, and feeling that it's their fault that they're not getting it. So rather than constant repetitions, if we rephrase, and it can be a really subtle rephrase, but if we rephrase rather than repeat, that helps them to give themselves a bit more time to understand, to process. And it assumes that they need a little bit of assistance rather than assuming that they're just not getting it. So it's a much kinder way to help give information and help encourage that understanding. One of the other things that is, I think, more and more prevalent now is that understanding of diversity and autism within that is something to be celebrated. It's not something to shy away from or to hide. It's something that is a part of a person, and we need to be accepting of that and praising and supporting how they show their strengths and skills, and encouraging them to do that themselves as well. And finally, I think as families, this is much easier, but giving that unconditional positive regard, even when we're really tired, and it's been a very difficult night, and perhaps you're watching this at, as Angie said, at 2 o'clock in the morning. But hopefully it's something that we can do even when we're really tired. But it's also something we can model to other people to do. And I think that's really important. Wider family networks, educational settings, if we can let them know what works for the children to help them to feel connected, to feel supported, to feel safe, to feel trust, through that idea about unconditional positive regard. That's incredibly protective for the young people that we're talking about today. So taking all that on board, I wanted to hone in on that idea about validating and normalizing emotions. And there are several ways in which we can do that enable those with autism to understand their emotions more, learn how to manage them, and learn how to communicate them effectively. And what I'm about to give you is a list of ideas that may very well be things that, and I'm sure that you are already doing, but I'm just giving them a label and a framework of theory to understand why they're being helpful. So bear with me as I go through the next couple of slides, but hopefully it's helpful. So those kind of ideas of emotional support. The first one to look at is that idea of emotional modelling. I think this is very well known within sort of the people are working around children and young people with autism. We do that. Look, you can see I'm feeling a bit anxious at this change of classroom because I'm frowning and my eyes are darting. I think I'm just going to take a few deep breaths and look around, and then I'll be calmer and I'll be ready to kind of do the task, do whatever it is I'm doing. So that emotional modelling, letting the child, the young person hear you talking about what you're experiencing, how you're experiencing it, how you're labelling it, and what you're going to do about it. That whole process, that whole piece of information is incredibly supportive. And if we're modelling it to them at home and we're then giving others the sorts of things that we do at home that's helpful, that can be really supportive to the wider network to understand what works for that child. Now, alongside emotional modelling, we get that emotional reflection. This is when we talk about what we can see them doing. So that's the idea of, look, I can see you feeling worried about this change of classroom. I'm sticking with the classroom analogy, bear with me. But I can see you're feeling worried about the change of classroom because you're frowning, your mouth is tight, and you're pacing. Take a deep breath, clench your fists at the same time, then unclench them as you let that breath go. This will help you to calm, and we can look at the room together and find your seat. So doing that validation, giving the information that you can see, perhaps introducing a little strategy like that calming breath alongside the clenching and unclenching of the hands, and then giving a solution. Let's work together to find your seat. That whole process again enables them to be hearing, okay, that's how I'm experiencing, that's how I'm presenting that emotion. But also, here's what I can do about it. Yeah, I remember doing that, breathing and clenching fists before. Yeah, I know that works. And that repetition of the modelling and reflection over time together can then help the young person be in a position where they can then go, just need to take a few deep breaths right now. Just need to clench and unclench my fists and I'll be fine. So it gives them those skills to hopefully then enact those things later on themselves. The other thing that goes alongside these two is the idea of emotional checking. So this is when we can have a situation where the young person is developing their ability to communicate, spot, understand, communicate their emotions. But we still need to give them a bit of a hand. And we're also in a position where we might not quite be sure what's going on. So this is us checking in. I can see that you're frowning, your mouth is tight and you're pacing. Are you worried about this change of classroom? So we're giving them a bit of reflection, but then we're doing that little checking in, introducing that idea of, is it the worry that's doing this? And then we can hopefully move on together to think about, okay, well, what can be done to help? And alongside what can be done to help, we can introduce those grounding techniques, the ones that make us feel safe and secure in moments where our emotions are going into heightened states. So I can see you're feeling worried about this change of classroom. You are safe. I am here with you and you know me. Let's take a deep breath together and then we'll find your seat. So that idea of being with the child and the young person in the moment, giving them that message of, look, I'm here, I've got your back, I'm here, I'm in your corner with you. Let's work it through together. Just letting them know that they're safe, letting them know that you are there for them and that they are okay. And repeating that with the idea of, right, let's take a few deep breaths together and then we'll do the next step, is a really solid way of helping them to move on when things are getting a little bit too much. Now, the next two I'm going to go in a bit more detail about. But one of the things we can also do is introduce what I call thinking brain activities. So this is something I talk a lot about in the context of experiencing heightened emotions, particularly when they are linked to trauma experiences. So, and that trauma that in the examples that I've given thus far is a trauma of a change happening that wasn't expected, hasn't been communicated, but the individual is expected to just cope with that. And that's really tricky. Just thinking I could give so many examples from my own life on this one. But anyway, so thinking brain activity. So one of the things that happens when we have an experience that is triggering for our emotions, particularly when that experience is related to being misunderstood or something happening that we can't understand and hasn't been communicated well to us, is a disconnect between our emotional part of our brain and our thinking part of our brain. And we can use the hand brain model. Please feel free to Google that. There's a really nice clip on YouTube that's Dan Siegel's hand brain model. But the idea is that the hand becomes the brain, with the brain stem coming up, and the fingers are the thinking part of the brain, and the thumb over here is the emotional part of the brain. And normally they're nice and connected together. But when we experience a heightened emotion, they start to bubble, they start to disconnect, and the thinking brain eventually disconnects. The emotional brain is the bit that's doing the running of things, and thinking is offline. So they call this flipping the lid, which is probably a phrase you've heard of quite a lot. But one of the things we can do to bring the thinking brain back online and get that connection going again is to think about sequencing and ordering activities. So really neat ones to have at home might be things like sorting magnetic numbers on the fridge. It might be putting letter cards into an order, coloured pencils into the order of the rainbow. Anything that you can think of that will introduce that idea of sequencing or ordering is a really effective way of helping getting that thinking brain back online. Now, we can do that in moments when we can see that the young person, the child, is gone over past the point of being able to think and reason, and we need to bring them back in. And we can combine that with other things that we know are really supportive. So, for example, if we know that weighted blankets are effective, we can put the weighted blanket round while we count from 10 to 1. Now, but anything again that involves a sequencing and ordering while you're doing the weighted blanket, the band, it's resistance bands, while you're doing walking, all of those things will help to keep that thinking brain back online. And then we can do the modeling, reflection, checking, grounding techniques, because they're in a better position to take that on board, because the thinking brain is doing the thinking again. So I hope that makes sense. I'm happy to talk about a little bit more, but we'll see what questions we get at the end. And the other thing we can do is think about our language and our terminology. And I talk with schools an awful lot about this and the use of scripts. And the use of scripts is a really important one to achieve all of the things that we've talked about in terms of emotional modelling, reflection, etc., but also going back to those protective factors and that validating and normalising of emotions. So on the next slide, I'm just going to go through the script that I would encourage you to use. I use this with my own children and my other half, just don't tell them I do that. So scripts then. So the first thing we do when we're thinking about scripts is to think about how we can recognise the feelings in the person that we're seeing. So an example script might be like, I can see you're angry. I'd feel angry too if I thought something was going to happen and it didn't. So that's just one sentence that lets them know, I totally get where you're coming from. It's okay. Then we can validate that feeling. So that's the second part. It's okay to feel angry. Anger isn't an emotion. We can experience it. It's okay to feel angry. Again, all emotions are valid. It's how we communicate them that's the key. So we do also need to let our children, young people know what's not okay in that display of emotion. So in this instance, the example would be, look, it's not okay to throw things. It's not safe for you. It's not safe for others. So we just let them know, okay, I get you're angry and I get why you've thrown whatever it is you've thrown, but that it's not okay to do that. So having introduced that boundary, we then need to help them move on. So we might start with an alternative action. Or for example, look, wrap yourself in your weighted blanket. That's going to help you feel calmer. So we can give that alternative action. So at this point, we're not looking to help them to think about what might be done differently. We're just helping them in the moment. And we're using our knowledge of what works well for them to do that. So introducing that alternative action. And then we do a little bit of problem solving. If you feel angry again as something has happened, something hasn't happened when you're not expecting it, just grab your blanket. Grab your blanket. It's okay to do that. So we're reinforcing that this is a helpful thing to do, and we're letting them know that this is something that is something you can do whenever you feel that feeling again. And we also need to let them know then that we can do that repair work. We want them to put themselves in a position of being able to go, okay, well, in the future, look, I felt really angry. I've got my weighted blanket. I know I just need to say sorry or pick that up in the way that we would also do. So we can say, well, now you're calm, you do need to pick the toys up and put them back. So we're not in any way here going down the sanction route. We're going down the validation, normalizing of feelings, letting them know what the boundaries are, providing alternatives, helping them think about how they can manage emotions. And this is our way of using our language, our knowledge, to support the young person develop their language and knowledge around emotions. And as we're doing that, and as they are skilling themselves up, we are supporting them to have ways in which they can express themselves that are helpful for them and for others. But what we also need to do is make other people aware, look, this is what is helpful to them when they feel this way. They need to get their blanket, so let them get it. So having that dialogue across contexts is also really helpful. There are some really nice resources out there that can also help young people understand how they are, how they're feeling. This is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just the ones that I've used myself and I also like to recommend. And they're probably ones that you've heard of before. So just putting those up there as reminders or as things that you might want to look at. The camouflage one is for older teens, but it is quite a useful one, and it's done in a kind of what's the word I'm looking for, graphic novel style, but it's really nicely done and really easily accessible. But that's for kind of older teens, older female teens. But they are all really nice books and very accessible for young people and for adults as well if you wanted to have a look. But like I said, you may have already come across them, in which case apologies for any repetition there. Now, in all of this, whether we're supporting the young people through using scripts, through going emotional modelling, etc., exploring themselves and how they work, we also need to think about the impact on us as adults. So I just wanted to add in a little bit at the end here around just the idea of self-care. It's a hard job being a parent of someone with autism. And just thinking about that at 2 o'clock in the morning, if you are watching this at 2 o'clock in the morning when your child isn't sleeping, we need to know what we can do to help ourselves so that we can then help them. So letting go of things like the green around the circle, It's really important. It's hard sometimes, but it is important. Um, to then help us think about, well, what are the things that I can control so that I'm focusing on those. So again, no, by no means an exhaustive list, but just some things that we know we can let go of to help us manage in the moments that, particularly when those moments are really tricky, but also to help our young people and children as well as in those moments. We can't control what other people think. Hopefully, we can raise understanding, but what they think in the moment, can't control that. What we can control is our own thoughts and actions, and making time for ourselves so that we can top ourselves up so that we're ready to support and give that emotional containment is a really, really important thing to do so that our cup is at least always half full, if not a little bit more. So, ending on that idea of self care, then, I know that sometimes people can, I think, ask questions via reminds and then they can let me know. But I'm just going to stop sharing and come back to the main room. There we go.
That's great, thank you.
Feels like a whistle stop tour, but
No, it was really good. What I'll do is I'll stop the recording